Very happy to have a nice crowd, still a few more folks coming in here today. We're very happy to have sort of a co-sponsorship of this event with accounting or accountancy and the School of Business. Dean Mark Wilder is here, as is Dean Will Norton. And I'm sure that there are a few students here representing business and accountancy as well. So we're really happy to have you here. Of course, always love to see our journalism and IMC students here. Tonight we have a really exceptional program planned for you. We have two gentlemen who, between the two of them, have almost 100 years of experience in broadcast journalism, so that's pretty dang impressive. And they're still fighting the good fight. Fred Young, immediately to my left, is a former senior VP news for the Hearst Television Corporation. Hearst TV, if you don't know, is routinely listed as the best or one of the best local television news companies in the country to work for, primarily because of their dedication to good ethical business practice and the support of credible journalism. And this day and time, there's nothing more important than being able to trust the information that the media are providing. To his left is Hank Price, who has long been a very good friend of our school, the School of Journalism and New Media. He's the general manager for WVTM in Birmingham. And he is really, what I would call a mensch. If you don't know that word, look it up. But someone who is always willing to give up his time and his expertise to help us do a better job of teaching our students how to produce credible journalism, and just generally someone who is helping to keep our industry strong. So with that, I'm basically going to turn over this conversation to the two of them. I think our listening to them will help illustrate sort of the challenges and opportunities that the local news business are facing better than anything I could do in terms of leading a conversation. So welcome. I'm very happy to have you here, and take it away.
I'm Fred. I'm the older one. He's the young, good-looking one.
That would be me.
I'm kind of offended that he's a mensch and I'm not. I will tell you that I was complimented a couple of weeks ago. I was invited somewhere to speak briefly and at another university for a mutual friend of Will and mine. And I was driving home and I said to my wife, because a few people had patted me on the back because they were obligated to pat me on the back for schlepping there. And I said, there really aren't many good speakers on the topic of journalism anymore. She turned to me and said, one less than you think. So here we are. There's actually one less than I think now. The good one here is Hank. But we've been asked by Will and Professor Wenger to talk on ethical business and whether ethical business is good business in the field of television news or TV in general. How many of you are journalism students? With a show of hands?
A lot.
A lot. And how many of you are business students? So what are the rest of you? What are your majors? Are they integrated marketing students? Scott, has a lot of people here, right?
A lot of IMC.
Okay, all right, that's cool. Well, thank you for coming. 5:30 in the afternoon, I know, is a tough time in the college world. It's time to get dinner, get out your card, go to the cafeteria. Is that the way it works around here? Chow down and then get on with your work. When I taught journalism, when I retired a few years ago, I taught 3 or 4 years at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I did all this preparation, and I had lesson plans, and I had syllabi and syllabuses, whatever, and every week I'd worry about whether it was going to fly and make for a good class, and then within the 24 hours prior to the class, there would always be some stuff that would hit the fan in our business or in media or in politics, and it was like, well, throw out the lesson plan, let's just go in and talk about this as an ethical issue in our business. So we're going to talk a bit about that stuff today. We've been asked to elaborate on why ethical business is good business. But from our perspective, at least from my perspective, today's a bit different. Ethics in media may depend on who you work for, whether you're from a red media or a blue media, whether you're liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. You get my point. There are different rules and different standards for ethics. But before we go much further, Hank and I really believe that ethics are worthy of a discussion, worthy of practicing in business and journalism and in your personal life. I don't think you disagree with
No,
that.
there's no question. Ethics really are a business decision, because if the audience doesn't trust you, you're out of business. And our particular business, while you have national media, which is taking sides, we're responsible to our local users. And that's why they trust us. And if we do anything to take away that trust, we're out of business.
Okay, if you'll allow me 1 minute to go back to my old days of teaching ethics, I just want to show off a bit and remind you of the two powerful incentives for ethical journalism. How many of you have studied ethics per se at this university? I know there's an ethics course here. The first incentive is the moral incentive, which is built around decency and honesty. That's the stuff your parents teach you as you're growing up. The second incentive is the practical incentive, which promotes credibility in public service. Let's touch for a moment on the First Amendment, which supports our profession, and let's not forget that the First Amendment was written to insulate journalists from those who want to control the flow of information and those who resent how they're covered by the media. There's a downside to press freedom. Anyone can become a journalist. I think probably by now you've figured that out, no matter how unqualified or unscrupulous. And the First Amendment will protect that person. We've learned a lot about unscrupulous and manipulative journalism, particularly since the last election, going all the way across the pond to Russia. And today we live with the stigma of who is a journalist, perhaps because they disagree with what you say or write about what political perspective you believe. I think Hank would agree that we should concentrate, at least at first, on local news, since that's where he and I come from. That's the one branch of the news business, and we were talking about it earlier with some of the reporting classes, where there is the highest level of regard and respect for what we do.
Yeah, the First Amendment was written with the idea that the citizens should be smart enough, educated enough, and informed enough that let everybody have their say. And the citizens should be able to determine who's telling you the truth and who's not. And actually, the world that we live in now, where anybody can be a journalist, the internet, mobile, all the things you can do, fits with the idea of the founding of the country, where it was all newspapers. But, in Chicago in 1925, there were 40 daily newspapers. Think about that for a minute. Opinions and ideas. In the end, it comes down. But the advantage of being local is if I put something is on my television station that is wrong, the local people who live in the community are the ones we hear from. If they choose to stop watching us, we're out of business. And so it's very direct. When you get to the national level, there are so many layers between someone in New York and someone in Oxford, Mississippi. It's very easy for someone in New York to not take into account the end user. Also, the way the business models work. Cable television is not supported by advertising. It's a second revenue stream. It's supported by the payments that people make for cable, for satellite, and now over-the-top services. That's what supports their business model. And therefore, that insulates them from the consumer at the end. We don't have that. We're directly responsible to our end users.
Some of the biggest issues that we have faced in broadcasting as an industry, locally, and we'll talk about some local examples in a moment, and at the network level, involve people. Sometimes people can get you in the biggest jam and cause you the biggest headache than other things. Let's talk about some issues and some personalities that you all relate to. The Me Too movement. I mean, we all know what that is. I think no matter, forget the political persuasion, we're all we're all sympathetic with it. But it started with Harvey Weinstein. We don't have to discuss Harvey Weinstein here today because we're broadcasters and we teach communications. But what about Charlie Rose and Les Moonves, who used to run CBS? Does CBS get any ethical points for moving on those two guys? And did they move quickly? And did they do the right thing? What do you all think? You all know who Charlie Rose is, and you must know about Les Moonves. Does anybody have any thoughts? Let's make this interactive. Faculty? Deborah, come on, speak up.
Well, I think it's less of a, in my view, it's less of a getting points for taking action, but it would be losing points for not taking action. That, in other words, in some respects, I feel like CBS felt it was forced to do something because of what they might have experienced had they not.
Another CBS issue, and this is just a couple of weeks old, and again, at least acknowledged by a show of hands if you followed this particular incident. You know, the man who produced 60 Minutes for many years, who succeeded Don Hewitt, his name is Jeff Fager. He was recently let go. He was let go because they were working on a story at CBS. This is CBS Night here at University of Mississippi. They were working on a story about some allegations against the way he treated people, probably, I think, the way he treated women. And it was assigned to a reporter by the name of Jerika Duncan. And apparently she had tried to ask him some questions. And he wrote her an email, which, from what we've all read in the press, was basically threatening. Probably not the smart thing to do. Whether it was ethical or not, it was threatening. So she read the email, she was alarmed by it, and she took it to her boss, the president of CBS News, and Fager was fired. Much quicker than, I guess, Charlie and Les Moonves in the face of those accusations. Any of you heard this story? You familiar with that? You must, some of you, the faculty was familiar with it, I hope. But CBS had the reporter, Jerika Duncan, do that story on the air. She said, you know, I was asking Fager the question. I wrote him an email. He responded to me. I became alarmed. I'm paraphrasing here. And I took it to my boss, Mr. Rhodes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and Fager was fired. That bothered me ethically a little bit. It would have been okay if they would have interviewed her about the incident since she was a principal in it. How do you guys feel about now injecting reporters into a first-person kind of issue about a dispute that where they, just by asking a question, were responsible for the firing of the producer of 60 Minutes? Any thoughts on that? No? Nobody has any opinions? Dean Norton, come on. What do you think?
I'm not a big believer in political correctness.
You're kidding.
I think you ought to be able to say what you think so that I can know where you're coming from.
Okay.
A lot of this is political correctness, which makes it hard to, it's really hard to come down to the real issues. But we're following rules so that we look good. And that's what bothers us with a lot of the ethics issues is you take a side and there's a bad guy and there's a good guy. And who of us is a good guy?
Well, a lot of it, in my mind, comes down to what would you do? You know, it's the old what would Will do, what would Hank do, what would Fred do? What would
Yeah.
you do? What would you have done?
It's a hard question, but I tell you what I would like to say. You talked about Les Moonves. When I worked for the CBS O&O division years ago, I was at a dinner one time in L.A., and somehow I ended up sitting next to Les, and on the other side of me was my boss, John Severino, who ran the O&O division. Across from him was Roger King, you know, Roger, the syndicator guy. And we're having dinner, it's a regular business dinner, and Seb, my boss's secretary, comes over and brings him a drink and sits down in his lap. And I got to tell you, maybe I'm naive, but I was shocked that that would happen. And I've been in this business a long time, and I worked a lot of places, but I'd never seen that happen. And I'm sitting there kind of, and I look at Les, and he's having dinner. It didn't bother him. And I thought, well, clearly this is not the first time Les has seen this or something like this. So I think we've gone from a system where a lot of things happened that were bad and were unacceptable to all of a sudden now we've gone the other way where people are so frightened and scared that you fire the executive producer of 60 Minutes without maybe getting all that. And I'm not saying he shouldn't have been fired. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting
Without a hearing.
without a hearing. I think we've gone from an extreme where things were accepted that shouldn't be accepted to now the other end of it. Somewhere we've got to have something in the middle.
It's interesting. This is not in chronological order, but it's something I think you could comment on because you run an NBC affiliate and you've been around NBC for a long time. Quite a few years ago, Brian Williams was caught, if that's the right word, making some exaggerations. I don't remember whether he hit the home run for the Yankees that won the World Series in whatever year it was.
Well, the rocket's coming up.
Or he
and
was the
fire,
second man to walk on the moon. He misstated some facts. I'm being facetious, but because, by the way, I think he's still the best anchor person on TV today, working over on cable at MSNBC. But he was immediately put on the shelf for a long time, and then when they brought it and replaced on NBC by another equally competent person, by the way, by Lester Holt.
Who I once let go, but that's another story.
Right. But who's a very talented person and worked at the Hearst station in Sacramento when he was a kid. But now Brian is back, but he's on cable, you know, and it looks like he may be on cable for a long time. But he got my point is not Brian Williams per se, but to Will's point, he got a second chance.
Yeah,
to
he
your
did.
point. So
And there are
not
other people
everybody
that-
gets a second chance.
Yeah, and that's, we kind of live in that world. But if you look at what he did was not sexual. And everybody knew he was that way. Everybody knew that he exaggerated, that he said stuff he shouldn't do. The problem is when you get a job like that, it's very difficult for anybody to tell you the truth. You start living in this little bubble where you fly in private jets, where you've got an entourage where people are enabling you. Whatever it is, they'll enable you. And as a result of that, he got enabled and suddenly he went publicly too far. But it didn't involve sex, and I think that's why. I think it would be very difficult for somebody who has some issue that involves that to come back in today's. Charlie Rose being a great example who, I mean, we heard recently that he was trying to do something to come back.
He's trying to come back.
Nobody's going to touch it.
Which is not an ethical issue per se, but that's the environment that broadcasters and journalists are living in today. One that I'll tell you about, and I think perhaps the faculty would know, and maybe some of you guys who read more than others might know. I'm a Pittsburgh guy, so I sort of follow the media in Pittsburgh. And there's in that part of the country, there's a very well-known political cartoonist by the name of Bob Rogers. And Bob Rogers is a really good, funny, acerbic political cartoonist. And over the last couple of years, since November of 2016, he's drawn a lot of pictures that have poked a lot of fun at the guy in the White House. So now you rewind a little bit, and the publisher of that paper is a man by the name of John Block, whose grandfather, whose grandfather owned that Toledo Blade Company and published the Toledo paper, the Pittsburgh paper. John Block started to exercise some editorial influence on Bob Rogers, ordering the editor to send the cartoon back. First of all, he ordered the cartoons to pass across his desk. And they started to kill virtually every one of his cartoons. And you know, today in this day of the internet, they all got published somewhere anyway, and most of the ones he killed were pretty funny. But the ethical issue to me is not the cartoon and not what he said, because I guess an editorial cartoonist should have the editorial ability to say whatever he wants. But should publishers be involved, and publishers/owners be involved in in making editorial judgments on what goes into a newspaper. What do you guys think? How many of you have edited a newspaper, taken newspaper courses? It doesn't make any difference. It could be a TV piece. What do you think? Anybody? What do you think? Since, Hank, you're the only one who will respond to me.
Well, I can tell you, I have a personal rule, I never make a news decision. I never. And here's the reason why. Because once you make one, then you're in the process and you change the process. And the process should be, on this story, what are the merits of this story? But if the news director thinks, what does the general manager want me to do? All of a sudden, the process is ruined. That's all it takes to ruin the process. And I can see the same thing with publishers. Once the publisher does something, all of a sudden people start second guessing them. And, you know, if we have a reporter that lies, if we purposely do something that's wrong, they're going to hear from me, and we're not going to put up with that. But I'm not going to tell the news director that I disagree with what her lead story is tonight, or whether or not she should have covered something, although I sometimes do.
But you don't do political cartoons per se, but you do have editorials on your station. And
Yes, I do editorials.
Nobody's
Governor
managed.
loves me right now,
Right.
but
Well, it's,
because she won't do an interview, but that's another story.
so you won't be going to the State House tonight?
I won't be invited to the State House, also to City Hall in Birmingham.
Oh, in Alabama.
I haven't been
right,
nice to
right,
them
right.
either.
Hank has a second home in Mississippi, but he still works in
French
Alabama.
Camp, it's the best part of Mississippi.
I don't know. I'm a Pittsburgh guy. I don't know where French
Yeah,
Camp is. So anyway, so we've had a couple, we're going to talk some more about some of these ethical personnel issues, but you know, transparency is one of the classic challenges of ethical behavior. And we've had some incidents. We thought you'd be kind of interested in it. There's nothing funny about them, by the way, but it would be interesting to get your reaction if you care to react. Some years ago, and very few people in this room might remember this, but I was about to become general manager of the station, the Hearst station in Pittsburgh in 1980, and we carried a program called The Lottery. You guys know what The Lottery is. How many of you have seen The Lottery on a local television? The balls go around, whatever. Well, it turns out that one of our the guy who was the voice and the face of the lottery, and 3 stagehands, you know, they were the people that sort of set up the machine and the balls, whatever, and 2 employees of the Pennsylvania Lottery who were on duty in the station every night conspired to fix the lottery. Does anybody remember that? Do you remember that? Some of you? No? So what they did, and this was pretty well known at the time, but 1980 was a long time ago. They took hypodermic needles and they injected either white, I don't remember, white paint or like talcum powder into the balls, into many of them. So when they turned on the machine, you know how they all bubble up? Not all of them bubbled up. A lot of them just sort of were lethargic, like when all the balls had the flu, except for the sixes and the 4s. And then these guys went out and played a number of combinations of those 2 numbers, and it turned out that 666 hit. And that group of 4 people and their friends, now these were stupid people because you don't tell your friends you're going to do this. A lot of money was won on 666 that night. To make a long story short, the state police investigated for a long time, and one day they showed up at our television station in Pittsburgh, and they said, oh, by the way, it was your guys. So we had a choice. Do we ignore it? Do we cover it as little as possible? And how do we handle it? So we made an ethical transparency decision, not only to cover it, but we had to admit it was our guys, because it was, and we were embarrassed by it. But we covered that story all the way through. And I will tell you that our competitors beat the hell out of us. I mean, they just really enjoyed relishing in our anger and angst and frustration. But we covered it. And a couple of years before that, we had a kid, totally separate, who worked in the mail room of the station. You know, the place where all the mail came? And it was the old days where this young man would go around and drop off mail to different departments. Apparently one night he had a date. He had a date with a girl who was a go-go dancer, and they went out after she was finished at the club. And when the date was over, he killed her. There's nothing funny about that. He strangled her. But it took, and left her body somewhere, but it took the cops several weeks to find out who had done it and where he worked. And eventually the trail led to our television station. Again, what do we do? You know, this was a pretty high-profile case, 19-year-old woman murdered in an alley, da-da-da-da-da. We addressed it head-on. So we always felt from a perspective of ethics, transparency, et cetera, that we did the right thing. There was, I think in the real world, even back then, there would be no way to avoid it. And then Hank, some years later, when we bought the station that he ended up managing, had one of a very special thing.
Yeah, now, are you talking about the Tolly car?
Tolly, yes.
Okay. I was running the Hearst station in North Carolina, and we had this young man who was our morning anchor named Tolly Carr. And Tolly had shot through the roof. People loved Tolly. His co-anchor, Kimberly Van Scoy, was about 40, and they had this thing, and Tolly would make, I called Tolly in one day. I said, Tolly, you can't make fun of Kimberly's age anymore. I know she likes it. You can't do it. Next day on TV, he said, I was told I can't make fun of your age anymore, so I won't. The ratings were shooting through the roof. Tolly was young and he was single, and the news director and I sat down with him when we gave him the job. We said, Tolly, no drinking, no partying. You represent this television station, and we want your word on that. We went through. Well, on a Saturday night, on Sunday morning, I was driving to church. Barry, the news director, was in New York. He called me. He said, I'm at the airport getting a flight home. Last night, Tolly got drunk. He had an employee in his car, not a station car. He was so drunk that he ran over a pedestrian and killed him. When the police came, Tolly refused the breathalyzer, so they took him to jail. They got a warrant for blood and took blood. And I didn't know what to say. I just kept driving. And he said, okay. So I immediately got on the phone to call my boss. I couldn't reach him. I called my boss's boss. You know, here's what's going on. And I headed toward the station. I called each of the department heads. You know, let's go. We've got to get together. Tolly called me just before I got. He was in tears. He said, I'm so sorry. And I said, Tolly, do you have a lawyer? He said, no. And I said, you need to get a lawyer and don't talk to me or anybody else for now. So we got everybody together, and I remember saying to the department heads, all right, this is a pivotal moment for us. If we lose the trust of our viewers, we're out of business. We're going to lose the morning ratings, and that's okay. We can rebuild that. We can't rebuild the trust. So we thought about who's the reporter in the newsroom that has no relationships with anybody. A guy named Bill O'Neill, crusty old guy, barely knew Tolly. Then we went out and found the photographer we thought had the least relationship, and we brought them in and we empowered them to cover this story no matter where it went and no matter what they found out. And we also made a decision that we were going to cover this more than anybody else. We were going to be completely transparent. Well, you can imagine what happened. This was front page news. It was a big deal. And when Tolly was arraigned, he pled not guilty. So now it's further complicated. I'm having to do interviews with other television stations. It was as big a deal as you think it could be. Meanwhile, Kimberly Van Scoy, who was the co-anchor, was on vacation. She called me. She heard about it. She said, I'm coming home. I'm going to go on the air in the morning. I said, Kimberly, you don't have to do that. This is a very personal thing. She had a relationship with this young man that was very close. And she said, no, I have to do it. I can't let it. So she came. We took about everybody off the news, and the next morning, at the beginning of every block, she read the story. She showed we had his booking picture up there with the blurry eyes, drunk. She went through the whole thing. She got through the block. We'd go to the break, and she'd collapse in tears on the desk. It would take her the entire break to get herself together. That she would come back and do the whole thing over. And this went on for 3 days. She called me at the end of the 3 days, said, I can't do it anymore. And I said, you didn't have to do it at all. Next morning she was there. And something happened between her and the audience that week. This was a woman that didn't even read the newspaper. Suddenly she became a different person. She became a leader. The viewers related to us. Our ratings never went down. Meanwhile, months and months this goes on. I later went back and counted them up on our website. I mean, we had hundreds of stories posted on the website. We covered everything that happened. We were completely transparent, and some stuff came out that was embarrassing too. Another one of our anchors was down there. Thank goodness she wasn't there. An employee was in the car. The family tried to find a way to sue us, and they couldn't because we had no culpability. And finally, the trial comes. And so we decided we're going to carry it live, every bit of it. And the trial started, and he pled guilty. He went to prison for about 2.5 years. He never worked in the business again. And I had said to employees, look, he's your friend. He can still be your friend. Don't shun him. He made a horrible mistake. He paid a big price for it. He's never going to work on television. Oh, and we would have viewers call and say, oh, you've got to hire him, or you've got to put him back. Or other viewers would say, how could you ever put him on TV? I'll tell you, at one point, a rumor started that he had committed suicide, and it spread like wildfire. Police departments in 2 different cities stopped our reporters to tell them how sorry they were that Polly had killed himself. Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center was mobbed with people. That's supposedly where he was. It wasn't true. But this tells you how big the story was and what it meant to people. So over time, things returned to normal. The ratings never dropped. If anything, the ratings went up over time. We were on the verge of becoming #1 at the time. Today, it's a dominant television station. And just before I left North Carolina, at Christmas time, Polly called me. And he said, I never apologized. And I said, Polly, that means a lot to me. I said, come by any time. And he said, you mean I'm not banned? I said, no, you're not far from the building. And he broke up and he hung up. So, I look back at that time and the terrible thing that you can do to yourself with a bad decision on that. But it was a pivotal time for our television station, because if we'd lost the trust with the viewers.
It speaks to the challenges that journalists face, because people who manage television stations or networks or cable networks or newspapers are faced daily with ethical decisions. Some of them are editorial, some of them are personal, and really a lot of personnel things that we all face over the years, the more contemporary ones. But
Well, and you know what? I left something out. I would just say, when he pled guilty, I chose not to fire him. I chose to put him on unpaid leave. But I couldn't announce that because it's a personnel decision. And so people would say, why haven't you fired him? And the reason I hadn't fired him was he had pled not guilty. So I was going to let the system, of course, we fired him once, and we weren't paid him. And his lawyer called me at one point. He said, can't you, he doesn't have any money. He can't even pay my lawyer fees. Can you, can you have him do something else? I said, no, I'm sorry. One thing I know, he's not ever going to work at the station again. That I can't.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
All right, let's pivot and turn to politics. I know you hardly ever discuss politics in America anymore, right? And I'll try to walk down the middle with this. I think that the country is kind of heated up, and it certainly is impacted on the media. and how we do our business. I referred before to red media and blue media, and the perception that perception by some that every media outlet they watch has one of those two colors, which is not necessarily true in the business that we operate in. But even though we suffered through the Judge Kavanaugh weekend, and at least that's past us for the moment, let's talk a little bit about truth-telling and how to deal with that. I think, in the last 2 years since Donald Trump became president, this is not a comment of criticism on my part, but he has been accused of occasionally stretching the truth. And the two largest national newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, have now counted his untruths, much the same way that, the Red Sox are counting the innings left before they lose to the Yankees or whatever the hot sports item might be. Are you guys, tell me about how you feel about the media being involved in constantly monitoring, not Donald Trump, but public figures for their veracity and their truth-telling. Anybody have a thought on that? Anybody bothered by that? Yes, sir. Please tell us your thoughts. Okay, all right. Anybody else? Hank, oh, yes, sir, go ahead. Stand up, would you, so we can hear you?
Yeah, I think sometimes they quote the person said without saying the context of what when it was said. So if it's kind of a controversial quote, they won't say any of the conversation leading up to it. They'll just say what the quote said and they'll make that.
So if you were an editorial person running a newspaper or a television newsroom, local station or network, would you use the word lie or untruth if you're, and again, take it out of Trump's, it could be the governor of Mississippi, it could be your state legislator, wherever you're from, somebody in Alabama or Arkansas, wherever. Would you use that word?
I mean, it's a headliner, so if you're looking for people to like click on the story from an online basis, if you say, Donald Trump lied about this, I'm going to click on that because it's just like, oh, he lied, oh my gosh, you can look at that. So, I mean, it gets your views, but I don't know if it turns out that it's not, it ruins the trust, you know, what Hank is saying.
Well, but first I assume you'd confirm it was a lie. And then you'd have to make the decision as to whether to use it, correct? Okay, not just because some person across the aisle said it was a lie. How about political advertising today? There's some of the worst stuff in the world on political advertising. There's some disgusting stuff in political advertising today. You've all seen the ad where this whole family says, don't vote for John Jones, don't vote for John Jones, don't vote for John Jones, and it's like they go down this group of 5 people and they all say, he's our brother, and don't vote for him. I mean, what's going on in this world? What do you think about this?
Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that political advertising by a candidate is free speech, and therefore it is against the law for a television station to censor a political commercial by a candidate who's a regular registered candidate. There's literally nothing we can do about it. However, most of the money is not from candidates, from PACs. And PACs are a little bit different. And most television stations, and I agree with this, is you don't want the television station to be the arbiter of free speech. You don't want to say, my political message, it will only get on if it fits the standards of this television station. So we actually try to put it as much as we can. We're not going to put the kind of content on or allow that would be in a candidate, but both sides really need to have their say. Now, other people may disagree, but that's where I come down. This whole other subject you were talking, it reminded me of 1984, way before any of you were born. A guy named Gary Hart, who was a senator from Colorado, was running for the presidency. And Gary Hart was known as a notorious womanizer. Everybody in Washington knew about Gary Hart. It was very open, and there was a lot of talk about, well, what about when this comes out? His background, he's running for president. A reporter asked him about it, And Hart not only denied it, but he challenged the media to if you've got proof. Well, we all knew. So we had a meeting and we called the bureau chief down at the bureau at 2020 Elm Street. We said, "Can you come over to the TV station? We need to have an ethical discussion about what we're going to do about Gary Hart. Are we going to report what we know? Are we going to send reporters? Are we going to follow him around? Or are we going to expose him?" So we sat down, and I'll never forget, we had lunch, and we talked about it, and we decided that, you know what? We're not going to go into a candidate's background to report their private business that doesn't bear upon the office. Imagine that. So we made a decision not to cover it. Talked about it, talked with CBS Evening News, where did they want to cover it? No. Everybody agreed, we're not going to do that. 2 weeks later, the Miami Herald, Good Night Ritter's newspaper, broke the story and had pictures of Gary Hart with a woman, not his wife, on a boat called the Monkey Business. And it changed the way politics are covered.
And now you fast forward to 2008, when a neighbor, a well-known senator from a neighboring state, John Edwards from North Carolina, when the word was out in the business that he had a relationship with a woman who was traveling with his presidential. Do you guys all remember John Edwards? Most of you are old enough to remember him. And she was part of the traveling party, and there was a buzz that there was a relationship, and everybody was afraid to publish it. And
everybody knew it.
He had a wife, Elizabeth, right?
Right,
Elizabeth Edwards, who was a wonderful woman and had breast cancer and had suffered ups and downs, and I think she eventually passed away. But in 2008, I believe I was at St. Anselm's College in Manchester, New Hampshire, when he was there for a debate with Elizabeth, and I can visualize him walking through an auditorium like this after the debate, walking up and down the aisle, shaking hands with the people who stayed in the seats after the debate. Everybody knew it, but people were afraid of the ethical issue as it related to putting this thing on the air. And that, here's the irony of it, the National Enquirer published the story that John Edwards was doing some things with this campaign photographer. And then everybody jumped on it because they could say the National Enquirer reported tonight that Senator John Edwards, that's the way it was, a third-party attribution, right? There's an ethical side derailment. And, well, we all know what happened to John Edwards. And sadly, we know what happened to Elizabeth. And it did derail what was at the time a tremendous political career. But these are the kind of things, and now when you fast forward, the National Enquirer of all papers was the source for good information in 2008, and now the publisher of the National Enquirer has turned evidence, we're told by sources, against President Trump because they were the guys that were, what was the word, capturing all those stories, paying money for the stories about.
Yeah, and think about this, from 2008 to 10 years later now, everything is fair game. And the problem with everything being fair game is you don't know what's true and what's not. And so it's very difficult for the public to know, which comes down to who do you trust. And I can't tell you the number of times over the years that we've held a story because we couldn't confirm it when other people were reporting it. Just because in Hearst, you're not going to report a story you cannot confirm yourself and know for sure. It doesn't matter what everybody thinks. Can we talk about advertising for a second?
Why don't we talk about advertising?
All right.
Go right ahead.
So 4 years ago, Hearst bought this terrible NBC affiliate in Birmingham. The previous owners, who are fortunately out of business now, had done everything they could to destroy it. They had cut the staff. They had maintained it. They had furloughed employees. They'd done a lot of bad things. And one of the things that they had done was allow the sales department to take control of the television station. Everything that could be sponsored was sponsored. During the news, there would be a commercial crawl that would come across, go to Joe's to get your hamburgers or something. During the end of everything in the news was sponsored. Every feature, every segment, everything had a commercial, had a client on it. Perhaps the most egregious thing they did was have anchors in commercials. Now, they didn't like to admit that. They would pay, if you bought advertising on the station, you could appear in the news. And by the way, I found out that's a standard practice in Birmingham. It still happens on 3 other stations. It's unbelievable to me. The sales department ran the television station. So Hearst buys it. We don't know any of this stuff. I come in and I see all of this, and I start canceling it. I canceled. It took me a month to find it all. The sales manager wouldn't even come to my office because he was afraid what I was going to take away from him. So we got rid of the sponsorships, the commercials, everything. And then on top of that, we cut the number of commercials in the news because in Hearst, we have limits on commercials, self-imposed. Why? Because we think a 4-minute commercial break or a 3.5-minute commercial break is just, it's not good for the product. And I discovered some things as really get into that. First thing I discovered was you can sell your soul, but nobody is going to pay you what it's actually worth. And by that I mean, when you really look down to see how much money they were getting, it wasn't a lot of money. The problem is, once you start doing that, the advertiser says, well, look, I'm spending $80,000 for me. Give me this other. Give me that other. And they get it. A year later, the station set a revenue record with none of this and running less commercials. Why? Because we started investing in the product again. They'd actually stopped covering the news. Can you imagine that? They were just doing features. I remember I sat down with a news director, who's not there anymore, but was there for a while, very nice guy. And I said to him, well, you're doing these features, that's all you do. You're not actually covering the news. Why? And he said, well, we tried that, it didn't work. I said, oh, really? And then I said, and they had this slogan, accuracy matters. Everything said accuracy matters. They even had a segment where they shown where they had been inaccurate. I kid you not. I said, why do you say accuracy matters? And he said, we did some research and we asked the viewers if accuracy mattered, and they said yes. Oh. When a station loses its way, they lose their way in everything. But I can tell you from that, selling your soul is never worth it. I kind of do turnarounds. I go where there are bad TV stations. I did a turnaround in Minneapolis many years ago, a station called Care 11, NBC affiliate. And just before I got there, a reporter had spent a lot of time putting together a story about a problem with people stealing new cars off new car lots on Sundays when nobody was there. And the story never ran. And the people in the newsroom and in the newspapers were convinced that it had been killed because of advertisers. Nobody would ever admit that. But I did discover that salespeople were routinely going in the newsroom complaining or something. It was so bad that I set a rule. I went and talked to the sales department. I said, here's the rule, and I want you to hear this because I'm serious. If I go in the newsroom and I see a salesperson in there, it's your last day. I'm going to fire you right there. You go in the newsroom, I'm going to fire you. And it took that to get the place straightened out. But people think that they can make a short-term decision that will always come back and bite you. If you do something the best way to not make money is to do something just to make money.
Anybody have any questions or comments or anything you want to bring up? Anybody? So as we wind down, because it looks like we're cutting into your evening, and we appreciate you being here, just a couple of thoughts from some people who have been around for a long time. When you get into your business, whatever you choose it to be, whether it's advertising or marketing or television or radio or newspapers or the internet or all the things that came up here tonight, directly or indirectly, if you run into an ethical issue, don't do the kind of decision-making that is so prevalent today in the world, which is fire, ready, aim. There's just too much of that. There's too much of that in news coverage. There's too much of that in decision-making. Take a minute, step back, think about what you're doing before you really embarrass yourself, because there are no secrets anymore. You know, we can talk about the internet. We talked in a class this morning about Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I used to work for a guy who said you could make a big mistake and you could make a bad mistake, but never make a big bad mistake.
I
So
work with the same guy.
step back, take a deep breath, think about what you're doing, and I always counsel the people who ran our newsrooms and stations, if something, this is the time when the voice gives out dip, so we're right on schedule. If something bad goes on, take a minute after the newscast, after the paper is out, after the meeting, after lunch, and talk about it and analyze it. And what did we do? And did we do the right thing? So that if you made a mistake, you can at least correct it the next time. We have a little present for you. I'm sorry it's not fancier. It's just a Xerox copy, but it's a Radio Television News Director's Code of Ethics. There's so many codes of ethics. The newspapers have it, SPJ has it, the RTDNA has it, the New York Times has a code of ethics. It's on top, right? Pick it up as you leave the auditorium and stick it in your notebook and read it often. And I'm not going to read through it, but there are three major categories here: truth and accuracy above all, independence and transparency, and accountability for the consequences. And I'm sorry, I'll let you say goodbye, but I'm struck by a story that I saw recently when we were doing some research. There's a story about a young woman reporter who, by the way, was a graduate of Temple University in Philadelphia, crackerjack reporter for the New York Times. And she was covering one of the agencies in Washington, and she developed a really personal relationship with a guy she was covering. I mean, a personal relationship. And the Times printed a story about some things that were going wrong it happened to be the Trump administration, because it happened to be the administration in power at the time. This is not an anti-Trump story per se. But after the story broke, it got out that the reporter had a personal relationship, was involved with the guy who was her source on these indiscretions. And I was reminded that Abe Rosenthal, who was the long time ago publisher and editor of the New York, of the New York Times, once told his staff, "I don't care if you sleep with the elephants, just don't cover the circus." So those are the kind of things you have to remember when it comes to discussions of ethics. Sir, you want to say goodnight, Gracie?
Just one thing. I can't think of anything more embarrassing than retracting the story. Retracting the story says you took shortcuts, you didn't do your job. But I can't think of anything more embarrassing than that. But I can't think of anything worse than when you make a mistake trying to cover it up. Say, uncle, admit it, get it out there, and it will pass.
Any more questions? Any comments? Thank you all for coming at this. Yes, sir.
Well, and that's what you have to do. You have to humanize it. You have to say, what's the consumer, what information, what do they want to know, and tell them. Because I guarantee you, everybody's looking for a conspiracy, right? I mean, let's go back to the Kennedy assassination in November of 1963.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's looking for a conspiracy, and unless you are completely open, no one's ever going to believe you're telling the truth.
Well, you got to treat people fairly, and you have to take a step back sometimes and think about how you handle these things. Otherwise, you can look really bad. And there are a lot of companies that look really bad, and we've all heard those stories. But we're not here. I've been retired for a few years, and Hank is still operating what is now a very good station. But we're very proud of the background that we had, and the kind of standards that we instilled is such a stupid cliche word, but the kind of standards that we imposed on our people, and insisted that we have and we follow. And you should all do that in your business and or professional life, because it'll
it's a
make you look
business
good.
decision. It
Yeah.
is a business decision. We're in a business right now. We're in television. Massive debt, massive consolidation. Interest rates are going up. When we have another recession, I don't know when that will be. I hope not for a long time. It's going to push a lot of players out of the business, and you're going to have will come a time where there will only be a few left standing.
When you're faced with making a tough decision, take a step back. Don't feel the pressure. The young man up there alluded in this electronic world today. The clicks, be first. This ready, fire, aim thing it's not always so good. Okay, just take a step back, take a deep breath. I told one of your students today when we had a little chat, this little career session over at the broadcast center. What do we call it? The SMC, the Student Media Center. That how do we do this? Just take a deep breath, think for a moment, and then plow ahead with the challenge. But don't jump to conclusions, particularly as it deals with your public image, how you deal with your employees, and its impact on other employees, and to the business point and your business. Okay. Good night. Thank you.
And work for a quality company.
Work for
Thank you.
the company.
Thank you.